What if the moment Meghan Markle believed would be her grand Hollywood rebirth was actually the moment her entire career collapsed in front of people who would never forget it? What if the silence that fell across that Amazon MGM conference room wasn't just awkward, but historic, because the words Jason Orley spoke were so pointed, so precise, and so brutally honest that industry insiders whispered about them for days? And what if this story, the one she hoped would never leak, is leaking now because someone inside that room decided the world had a right to know the truth? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. These questions aren't just dramatic. They're necessary. Because behind the polished interviews, behind the glossy PR machine, behind the Instagram smiles and curated monologues about empowerment and authenticity, there is something else entirely. Something darker. Something more revealing. And it all came crashing down the moment Meghan walked into Amazon MGM Studios expecting applause and got the exact opposite. Let's start with the part nobody saw coming. Imagine a room full of some of Hollywood's sharpest minds. People who produce billion-dollar franchises. People who greenlight careers with a single nod. People who don't have time for noise, ego, or theatrics. These are the individuals Meghan Markle believed she could win over with a pitch polished by months of behind-the-scenes preparation. A pitch she thought would signal her triumphant return to the industry that had once dismissed her, underestimated her, and, if you ask her supporters, never gave her the respect she believed she deserved. But instead of a triumphant return, something else happened. Something humiliating. Something irreversible. The moment Meghan opened her mouth, executives glanced at each other. Tiny glances. Quick ones. But powerful enough to reveal exactly what they were thinking. The kind of glances that say, "Here we go again." The kind that say, "Why is she still trying this?" The kind that say, "This is going to be painful." And then Jason Orley, the director known for his sharp wit, his refusal to lie, and his legendary no-nonsense approach to creativity, walked in. The energy shifted. Not in Meghan's favor. Before we go deeper into that moment, you need to understand why this meeting mattered. Why this particular pitch session was supposed to be Meghan's chance at redemption. And why the people inside Amazon MGM had already been talking about her long before she stepped into the building. Hollywood never forgets. It might forgive if you're profitable enough, but it never forgets. Meghan's reputation had been circulating for months, no, years, wrapped in whispers, texts between agents, private Slack channels inside studios, hushed conversations during lunches at the Ivy, and even side comments at Hollywood's biggest events. Not just the Netflix fallout, not just the Spotify meltdown, not just the multiple projects that had been quietly shelved because her presence, according to insiders, created more complications than value. No, the problem was bigger. Executives felt Meghan was unpredictable, emotionally volatile, image-obsessed to the point of rewriting reality. And worst of all, she didn't understand Hollywood's most important rule: the room knows before you do. Meaning, when a celebrity is in trouble, when they're losing leverage, when audiences are slipping away, when their brand is becoming more liability than asset, Hollywood can sense it in the air like a storm rolling in. And when Meghan entered that Amazon MGM meeting, that storm was already overhead. But hold on. Before the storm breaks, let's take a step back and look at how this meeting even came to exist. For months, Meghan's team had been pushing the idea that Amazon was the perfect landing spot for her new slate of projects. A docuseries, a scripted drama, a potential memoir adaptation, and a lifestyle concept modeled loosely after Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop, though insiders quietly joked that Meghan wants Goop money without Goop discipline. Executives were skeptical, but Meghan's representatives pushed harder, insisting she had brand momentum, that she was finally being embraced by the American public, and that previous flops were simply learning curves. But something wasn't adding up. Amazon is one of the most metrics-driven studios in the world. Every pitch is data. Every decision is calculated. And their internal numbers told a story Meghan's team didn't want to acknowledge. Audience trust in Meghan had dropped dramatically. Viewership for projects tied to her name was unpredictable. Critics felt her narratives were repetitive. And unlike major celebrities who dominate box offices, Meghan's draw wasn't strong enough to justify the cost of the projects she wanted to lead. So why did Amazon agree to the meeting? Simple. Out of courtesy. Out of curiosity. And maybe, deep down, out of a tiny hope that Meghan's presence might surprise them. But the moment she began speaking, executives realized they were not about to be surprised. They were about to be reminded. Meghan walked in with what one insider later described as the energy of someone expecting a standing ovation before she'd even opened her laptop. Her tone was overly rehearsed. Her lines sounded like PR slogans instead of creative ideas, and the emotional connection that good storytellers rely on, it wasn't there. The disconnect became painfully clear when she tried to explain why she was the ideal face for a new scripted drama centered around a woman who rebuilds her life after escaping a rigid and oppressive monarchy. Executives didn't miss the metaphor. They weren't charmed by it either. One of them later said in a private group chat, "It felt like she was pitching her autobiography disguised as fiction again." But despite all of that, the moment that changed everything didn't come from Meghan. It came from Jason Orley. You need to understand who Jason is. Not just a director, not just a writer. A storyteller with a laser-like ability to sense authenticity. And when he senses something is off, he doesn't hide it. Jason listened to Meghan's pitch with the expression of someone trying to figure out whether this was a joke he wasn't in on. He leaned back. He cocked his head. He tapped his pen. And then, in that quiet moment where everyone expected him to ask a standard question, he instead said something that detonated in the room like a grenade. What he said is the heart of this entire expose. But before we reveal it, let's look at why it landed the way it did. Meghan's pitch had been filled with phrases like cultural relevance, female empowerment, reshaping narratives, and owning my story. Buzzwords. Empty ones. Executives had heard them all before, many times, often delivered by celebrities far more bankable than Meghan. And yet, somehow Meghan delivered them as if they were groundbreaking. As if she were handing the room a revelation instead of a recycled PR handbook. Jason saw right through it. He didn't just sense the script. He sensed the entitlement. Meghan wasn't pitching creativity. She was pitching herself. As the product. As the brand. As the story. And Hollywood had already seen this movie. It's called Meghan Markle, the post-royal reinvention. It didn't test well. And that brings us back to Jason's moment. In the middle of Meghan's monologue about how audiences are craving authenticity, Jason slowly lowered his pen onto the table and said something that no one expected. Something that made an executive literally stop breathing for a second. Something so blunt that one assistant outside the room later texted a friend, "You will not believe what Jason just said to her." We're getting there. But before the reveal, you need to understand the stakes from Meghan's side. For Meghan, this wasn't just another pitch. This meeting represented hope, a reset, a chance to prove she wasn't just tabloid noise, that she could lead, that she could be taken seriously as a creator and producer, and most importantly, that Hollywood still believed in her. But the moment Jason spoke, the illusion shattered. He exposed something Meghan's team had been terrified of for months. Hollywood didn't see Meghan as a creative visionary. They didn't even see her as an actor anymore. They saw her as a risk. And Jason said it out loud. His exact words will be revealed in the next chapter. You're going to hear them, word for word, exactly as multiple insiders claim he said them. But for now, understand this. After Jason spoke, the room changed instantly. Executives sat up. Meghan froze. And her team, watching from the doorway, began exchanging panicked glances. Because the humiliation wasn't subtle. It wasn't sugar-coated. It wasn't buried in polite industry language. It was brutal, and according to insiders, Meghan's Hollywood dream didn't just crack at that moment. It died. What came next would only make it worse. And no one, not even Jason Orley himself, saw the aftershock coming. They say every comeback story begins with a belief that the world is ready to see you differently. But what if the world has already made up its mind? What if the room you walk into has silently voted before you even sit down? What if your comeback isn't a comeback at all, but a countdown? That's exactly the position Meghan Markle walked into as she attempted to reignite her Hollywood career, a career she believed had been waiting for her return, but one that had quietly moved on without her. And not just moved on. It had evolved, hardened, and begun to evaluate her through a lens she never expected: risk analysis. Because Hollywood isn't sentimental. Hollywood doesn't base decisions on sympathy. Hollywood bases decisions on profit and threat. Meghan, unfortunately, had become a threat to budgets, to reputations, to internal harmony, and worst of all, to brand safety. But before those verdicts were carved into studio memos and group chats, before executives whispered the word blacklisted into one another's phones, there was a moment, an innocent window of time, where Meghan still believed she had a chance. This chapter is about that moment, the last breath before the plunge. Let's rewind the clock to 6 months before the Amazon MGM humiliation. Meghan's team had crafted a narrative about her return to Hollywood, whispering it to journalists, seeding it across entertainment blogs, and hinting at it during carefully staged paparazzi shots that mysteriously appeared with perfect lighting, flattering angles, and on days Meghan just so happened to be wearing her most producer-chic outfit. But there was a problem, a glaring one. Meghan wasn't being invited back by Hollywood. She was trying to force her way back in. And anyone who understands the industry knows one unbreakable rule. Hollywood invites you. You don't invite yourself. But Meghan didn't see it that way. To her, the industry had wronged her, undervalued her, treated her as if she were replaceable. Suits had minimized her during her time on the series. Directors hadn't respected her potential, and casting agents saw her as a mid-tier actress with limited range. And then the royal chapter happened. Explosive, messy, globally polarizing. Meghan believed that chapter elevated her, transforming her from a cable actress into a worldwide icon. But Hollywood didn't view it that way. In fact, insiders quietly said the opposite. She made herself radioactive. See, Hollywood can handle controversy, scandal, even chaos, if the celebrity is bankable, if audiences will show up, if the numbers justify the drama. But Meghan's trajectory told a different story. Numbers dropped, public trust fractured, projects struggled, and most importantly, studios lost confidence. In Meghan's mind, though, the Amazon MGM pitch session would be her redemption. The moment she regained control, the moment she proved she wasn't just a tabloid figure, she was a creative force. The road leading to that pitch was paved with manic preparation. Her team rehearsed lines with her for weeks. They practiced posture, pacing, pauses, and facial expressions. They coached her on terms she needed to sprinkle into conversations. Vertical integration, content curation, demographic resonance, story architecture. They built entire PowerPoints filled with abstract ideas, trendy buzzwords, and lofty vision statements. But not substance. Never substance. Because substance requires experience, and Meghan's Hollywood experience was limited to suits, a few Hallmark gigs, and a small scattering of auditions that never went anywhere. Still, her team pushed forward, convinced that charisma and confidence could compensate for credentials. There was just one problem. Hollywood can smell overcompensation like smoke before fire. Months before Meghan ever stepped foot into Amazon MGM studios, the whispers had already begun. A senior executive at another studio reportedly said, "Her expectations are unrealistic." A producer whispered, "She wants Gwyneth-level influence without Gwyneth-level success." And an agent, perhaps the most blunt of all, texted a colleague, "I don't know which is worse, her projects or her attitude." So when Meghan announced her interest in pitching to Amazon, the reaction wasn't excitement. It was concern, not for her career, for theirs. Because any studio aligning with Meghan risked being dragged into a media circus that had already swallowed Netflix, Spotify, and multiple PR teams who eventually said the same thing. Working with her is too chaotic. But again, Meghan didn't know any of this. Her belief in her star power had created a bubble, a tightly sealed one. So let's walk through the build-up to this infamous meeting, not as Meghan saw it, but as Hollywood saw it. Meghan's assistant began contacting Amazon MGM's scheduling office with increasing urgency, pushing for a meeting window that executives simply did not have available. Her team insisted they be slotted in before several legitimate production pitches, arguing Meghan needed priority consideration. Her publicist followed up with a letter describing Meghan's global cultural resonance, a phrase that made several Amazon staffers roll their eyes, according to an insider. Then came the press coincidences. Articles popped up conveniently about Meghan's creative rebirth. Outlets published flattering features about her upcoming Hollywood projects, even though no such projects existed yet. Even tabloids, often criticized by Meghan, suddenly received anonymous tips claiming she was in high demand. Insiders knew the playbook. This wasn't momentum. This was artificially inflated smoke meant to imitate fire. To Amazon MGM, it wasn't convincing. But they still accepted the meeting. Why? No one wanted to be the studio that turned Meghan down outright. The fear wasn't her career. It was her reputation for retaliation. Meghan had a history of framing rejections as discrimination or misunderstanding. She knew how to weaponize the press, and studios wanted no part of that fallout. So they agreed to let her pitch. Executives described their mindset as, let her speak, nod politely, move on. But Meghan misread that politeness as enthusiasm. On the day of the pitch, she arrived 22 minutes early, a power move. Dressed in what insiders described as Silicon Valley CEO glamour, a monochromatic designer look meant to signal authority without trying too hard. But it tried too hard anyway. Her team hovered around her like handlers at a royal event, adjusting her blazer, reviewing her notes, whispering last-minute reminders. Be relatable. Be confident. Don't get emotional. Remember the empowerment angle. Try to smile more. Less monologue, more conversation. They needn't have bothered with the last note. Meghan didn't plan to have a conversation. She planned to deliver a speech. A long one. Meanwhile, inside the Amazon MGM conference room, executives were preparing too, but in a very different way. One of them, according to a leaked message, typed this into a group chat. Brace yourselves. Another replied. Who's taking bets on how long she talks before letting us ask a question? A third joked. Someone set a timer. It was snarky. It was unprofessional, but it was honest. Because the truth was, they already felt this pitch was doomed. Not because they disliked Meghan, but because they didn't trust her. They didn't trust her narrative, her creative direction, or her ability to collaborate without imploding a project from the inside out. But perhaps the biggest red flag came the moment Meghan stepped into the room. It wasn't her smile. It wasn't her tone. It wasn't even her posture. It was the way she made the room freeze. Not because she was powerful, not because she was intimidating, but because the energy she brought with her was heavy, like everyone was suddenly expected to applaud before hearing anything. Executives exchanged subtle glances. Assistants shifted awkwardly. A producer quietly closed his notebook, as if deciding he wouldn't need it. This was the environment Meghan began her pitch in, an environment she misinterpreted as admiration instead of caution. But the most important detail of this chapter is this. Even though the odds were stacked against her, Meghan still had one chance left. A real one. If she had walked in humble. If she had walked in collaborative. If she had walked in willing to listen rather than dominate. If she had shown emotional intelligence instead of rehearsed monologues. She might have turned the room. She didn't. Instead, she walked into Amazon MGM studios believing she was the star they had been waiting for. And they walked into the meeting believing they were doing her a courtesy. Two opposing realities. One room, and one director, Jason Orley, who would tear the illusion apart with a single sentence. This chapter is the moment before impact. The next one is the collision itself. Because the moment Meghan finished her opening monologue, Jason Orley leaned forward, squinted slightly, and asked a question so cutting, so unfiltered, and so shockingly honest that the entire room went silent. But what he said, his exact words, would reshape everything that followed. And no one, not Meghan, not her team, and not even the executives who expected disaster, could predict the level of humiliation that was about to unfold. Jason Orley doesn't suffer fools. Ask anyone in Hollywood, and they'll tell you the same thing. He sees everything. He remembers everything. And he never forgets the type of person who walks into a room thinking the world revolves around them. Meghan Markle would soon learn this lesson the hard way. Jason wasn't some faceless executive. He wasn't a mid-tier producer trying to climb the ladder. He was a director with a reputation for brilliance and ruthlessness. People in Amazon MGM called him the guy who tells the truth, no matter how painful. That truth could launch careers or destroy them in a single meeting. Hollywood insiders describe him as a mix between a psychologist and a chess master. He watches body language, reads micro-expressions, and listens for contradictions in speech. He doesn't just process what people say, he anticipates what they're hiding. And he has a particular dislike for performative personalities, people who try to craft an image without substance. People like Meghan, unfortunately. But Jason's reputation wasn't built on cruelty. It was built on honesty. And honesty, in Hollywood, is rarer than diamonds. You see, studios spend millions creating illusions, perfect campaigns, controlled leaks, scripted press appearances. But underneath all the polish, real talent is measured in authenticity, and Jason could smell a lack of authenticity from a mile away. Before Meghan's fateful meeting, he had heard whispers about her. Industry chatter, texts between agents, gossip on Slack channels. The narrative was consistent. She had charm, yes, but she carried an entitlement that made collaboration volatile. She demanded control. She expected admiration. And she wasn't afraid to leverage the press if her ego was bruised. For someone like Jason, these red flags were flashing neon lights. But he didn't dismiss her outright. He was curious. How could someone with such global attention struggle to convince even a single room full of executives? That question intrigued him. It was a puzzle he couldn't resist solving. Jason prepared meticulously for this meeting. Unlike Meghan, who relied on rehearsed lines and team coaching, Jason did his homework. He studied every public appearance she'd made in the past 5 years. He analyzed the content she'd created, the interviews she'd given, the reactions from audiences. He noted the patterns. The moments where her charm faltered, the times she overcorrected, the instances of performative gestures meant to project empowerment. He also listened to the rumors, quietly cross-referencing them with facts. And what he saw painted a clear picture. Someone brilliant in flashes, but inconsistent and unpredictable. Someone whose personal brand was stronger than her creative output, but whose brand carried hidden liabilities. In other words, Meghan was powerful in perception but fragile in reality, a combination that could implode spectacularly if mismanaged. On the day of the meeting, Jason's entrance changed the room's energy immediately. He wasn't loud. He didn't announce himself with fanfare. He simply walked in, calm, measured, confident. His eyes scanned the room, noting seating arrangements, posture, and who held the notebooks. When they landed on Meghan, he raised a brow, just slightly, like a chess master acknowledging a worthy opponent, or a foolish one about to make a critical mistake. From the beginning, he recognized her pattern. The rehearsed hand gestures, the pacing, the over-enunciated phrases designed to impress. He recognized the attempt to dominate the room, to project power without substance. And he knew how to counter it. But Jason didn't act immediately. He let her speak. He listened. He absorbed every word, every buzzword, every attempt at charm. He was taking notes, not on paper, but mentally. He cataloged inconsistencies. He identified where confidence bordered on overcompensation. He mapped out the moments where she would likely stumble under pressure, and he waited for them to arrive. It wasn't cruelty. It was preparation. And then came the moment. Meghan launched into her monologue. She spoke about her vision for her projects. Empowering narratives, socially conscious stories, international appeal, and her unique ability to bridge celebrity influence with meaningful content. She punctuated every sentence with a carefully timed pause, a smile, a nod, a gentle lean forward. Everything was rehearsed. Everything was calculated. But Jason wasn't impressed. He detected the subtle cues of artificiality. He noticed the overuse of catchphrases, the inflated claims, the attempts to charm with statistics, and vague promises. To him, it was the same pattern he had seen in others before, celebrities trying to project gravitas without a foundation to support it. And yet, the room wasn't yet tense. The executives were polite, nodding, taking notes, occasionally glancing at each other. Meghan interpreted these reactions as engagement, as signs of intrigue. She was confident, perhaps overconfident, perhaps delusional, but she was convinced she was winning them over. That's when Jason leaned back. He paused. He tapped his pen lightly on the table, a subtle rhythm that drew attention. He didn't speak immediately. He let the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle her. She noticed. Her hand twitched slightly. Her pacing faltered for just a fraction of a second. But in that room, that fraction of a second was a window into her vulnerability, a window Jason would not ignore. And then he spoke. The words were deceptively simple. They carried no flourish, no sarcasm, no theatrics. but they were precise, surgical, honest. They pierced through the rehearsed narrative like a scalpel. He questioned the foundation of her pitch. He asked whether her creative ideas were truly hers or merely reflections of prior projects she had studied. He inquired about her ability to handle executive pressures without relying on personal branding as leverage. He highlighted inconsistencies between her public statements and the reality of her past projects. He did not ask these questions politely. He asked them in a way that exposed the fragility beneath the surface. Executives later reported that the room froze. Meghan's team, hovering just outside, whispered frantic suggestions: redirect, reframe, smile. But it was too late. The words had landed. The seed of doubt had been planted. The perception had shifted. Jason had achieved what insiders describe as a rare feat. He had punctured the illusion without creating a spectacle. He had humiliated subtly, but undeniably. He had communicated, in one precise series of sentences, that Meghan's perceived power and influence were fragile. And Hollywood does not forgive fragility disguised as authority. What happened next was a flurry of whispers, glances, and silent calculations. Executives started exchanging private messages under the table. Someone updated a spreadsheet that evaluated risk profiles for upcoming projects. Someone else noted the potential PR fallout if Meghan's behavior escalated. And through it all, Meghan continued to speak, unaware that the narrative had already shifted against her. This was not just a critique of her pitch. It was a verdict. Jason had communicated, without shouting or theatrics, that Meghan Markle's brand was a liability in this environment, that her presence in a room could destabilize a project before it even began, that her Hollywood comeback might never be realized, not due to talent, not due to vision, but because of credibility and consistency issues that no amount of charm could overcome. Yet Meghan didn't perceive the verdict. She mistook the silence for deep contemplation, the occasional nod for engagement. She continued, unwittingly, walking deeper into the trap Jason had laid. And that's the final piece you need to understand about Jason Orley. He doesn't just see the surface. He sees the architecture beneath it, the cracks, the vulnerabilities. And in Meghan, he saw enough cracks to suggest that any attempt to rebuild her career in Hollywood without addressing them would be doomed. By the time Meghan left the room, the executives had already begun discreetly contacting other studios. Notes were taken. Conversations had been initiated. Industry group chats were buzzing. And one word began to circulate quietly, cautiously, yet with devastating impact: risk. Meghan had walked in expecting a triumph. She walked out with a problem, not hers alone, but one the entire industry was about to acknowledge. And in that room, Jason Orley had not just challenged her pitch. He had challenged her persona, her strategy, and her assumed place in Hollywood. And as insiders would later confirm, that challenge was about to reverberate far beyond Amazon MGM. The Amazon MGM conference room wasn't just a room. It was a crucible. A place where careers were launched, tested, and sometimes destroyed with a single sentence. And on the day Meghan Markle walked in, that crucible was about to reveal the truth about Hollywood's tolerance, or lack thereof, for image-driven personas. The moment Meghan stepped into the space, she assumed control. Or at least she tried. Her steps were deliberate, her posture impeccable, every angle carefully considered. The lighting caught her just right. Her hair was swept into that signature sleek look, a combination of effortless and intentional. The assistants flanking her whispered last-minute cues: smile, nod, engage, authority. The energy was rehearsed, the aura curated. She believed in her charm, in her power, in the inevitability of admiration. She was wrong. The room's occupants were a mix of seasoned producers, executives, and creative directors. Some had been working in Hollywood for decades. Some had made billion-dollar franchises from nothing. They were polite, but their politeness was calculated. Their eyes scanned her, measured her presence, analyzed every gesture, every word, every micro-expression. These were people who could discern truth from fabrication in a heartbeat, and they were not buying what Meghan was selling. Before Meghan even opened her mouth, there was tension in the air. A subtle shift, almost imperceptible to her, but obvious to anyone attuned to power dynamics. An assistant later described it as a tense hum, the kind you feel before a storm breaks. It was the room's collective skepticism, manifested physically, pressing down on her shoulders without anyone saying a word. And then Meghan began to speak. She launched into her prepared monologue. Words flowed with precision, carefully polished for months of rehearsal. Buzzwords punctuated the sentences. Authenticity, empowerment, global reach, cultural impact. She painted vivid pictures of her proposed projects, tying them to social causes, international narratives, and her personal brand. Every sentence was designed to impress. Every phrase calculated to land with maximum impact. But the impact was off balance, forced, and most importantly, it wasn't genuine. Executives listened, nodding politely, but the micro-expressions betrayed their true feelings. Eyebrows rose in disbelief at certain claims. Lips pressed tight at overly ambitious statements. Fingers tapped pens subtly as if waiting for an opportunity to redirect the conversation. And all the while, Meghan believed the room was captivated. She believed she was convincing, persuasive, and commanding their attention. It was a fatal misreading. Behind the polite nods, a few executives had begun whispering to each other. Not loudly, not in a way Meghan could notice, but quietly, subtly. Phrases like, "Is she serious?" and "This is a problem," floated under the surface. Texts were exchanged discreetly. "Her pitch is impressive in execution but lacks authenticity," one read. "Risk factor is rising," read another. The words circulated quietly, a silent verdict being drafted while Meghan's voice filled the room. And then came Jason Orley. By now, Meghan had already established a rhythm, a cadence of control. She believed the room was responding positively. Her slides clicked, her gestures punctuated her points, and she even allowed a brief smile when she sensed approval, or what she perceived as approval. But Jason, sitting near the head of the table, had a different perspective. His eyes scanned her entire performance with precision. Every micro-movement, every carefully crafted phrase, every forced pause was logged in his mind. And he wasn't impressed. He leaned back, tapped his pen lightly against the table, and waited. Silence stretched. Meghan, thinking she had dominated the room, continued to fill it with her narrative. Jason didn't interject. He didn't frown. He didn't even look annoyed. He simply observed, calculating, assessing, waiting for the moment to act. And then it came. Meghan had just finished outlining a particularly ambitious project, a limited series blending personal memoir with global social activism, designed to highlight her journey from royalty to Hollywood entrepreneur. She concluded her monologue with a sweeping statement about authenticity and cultural relevance, expecting nods, applause, maybe even admiration. Instead, Jason spoke. It was calm, almost casual, but the words cut through the room like a scalpel. He questioned the foundation of her pitch. He asked whether her narrative could truly be executed without creating reputational risk. He probed her ability to collaborate without letting ego dominate the creative process. He highlighted discrepancies between her public persona and her past project outcomes. And he didn't do it with drama. He didn't do it with spectacle. He did it with precision. Executives froze. Meghan's team, standing behind her, exchanged alarmed glances. The tension was palpable. Jason's questions weren't hypothetical. They weren't critiques meant to be constructive in a friendly way. They were direct assessments of her reliability, her credibility, and her influence. And they landed exactly as he intended. Meghan's confident rhythm faltered. The carefully rehearsed cadence cracked. She stuttered slightly, searching for words that would maintain her image of authority. But Jason was already moving forward, mentally cataloging every response, every hesitation, every attempt to salvage control. In that room, every second mattered. And Meghan had just given Jason the insight he needed. The executives weren't laughing, but they were thinking, calculating, planning. In the same way that a chess player visualizes several moves ahead, they began to predict the trajectory of working with Meghan. They assessed the potential fallout. They debated internally whether her projects could succeed without incident. And they began to doubt whether her presence was an asset or a liability. Meanwhile, Meghan continued, unaware of the silent consensus forming against her. She misread the subtle cues, the raised eyebrows, the tight lips, the whispering hands. As thoughtful consideration, she didn't see the risk assessment ticking away behind polite nods and controlled expressions. She believed she was commanding attention. She believed she was winning the room. She was wrong. By the time the pitch concluded, the room had shifted entirely. What had begun as a potential opportunity had transformed into a scene of quiet judgment. Meghan had inadvertently revealed more than her creative vision. She had exposed her patterns, her inconsistencies, her reliance on performative gestures instead of substantive achievements. And in Hollywood, patterns matter as much as talent. As she packed up her materials, executives exchanged final glances. Text messages were sent. Notes were added to internal records. Some whispered phrases that would never appear in public. Not recommended, high risk, unreliable. Others documented the subtle errors, the over-reliance on image, the lack of collaborative nuance. And one word, unspoken but understood, began circulating quietly, blacklisted. Meghan left the room believing she had impressed. She left the room unaware that her reputation had shifted irrevocably. The moment she exited, the executives began strategizing about how to communicate their decision to her team without creating public backlash. They began contacting other studios, sharing information discreetly, warning them about potential volatility. And through it all, the narrative was forming. Meghan Markle was a risk that Hollywood was no longer willing to take. This was the moment that marked the turning point in her career. Not a single headline, not a single press release, not even a public comment. Just the quiet, professional assessment of a room full of industry insiders who had seen enough. And at the center of it all was Jason Orley, the director who doesn't bluff, the director who doesn't flinch, the director who had seen through the performance and called it out, silently but definitively, changing the course of Meghan's Hollywood trajectory in a way that would reverberate for months. But what came next, the private messages, the leaks, the group chats, would escalate everything to a level Meghan couldn't anticipate. What started as a controlled assessment was about to turn into a public narrative, one that would humiliate her and effectively end her chances of being taken seriously by the very industry she thought she could command. It started with a joke. A single, offhand comment. Nothing anyone could have predicted would explode into a humiliation so complete it would echo through Hollywood for weeks. But in the case of Meghan Markle at Amazon MGM Studios, even the smallest misstep could set off a chain reaction that no amount of preparation, PR, or carefully rehearsed charisma could stop. The room had already been tense. Executives were quietly assessing every detail, every gesture, every word that came out of Meghan's mouth. Her pitch had been thorough, precise, and polished, but the polish hid a lack of authenticity that seasoned Hollywood professionals could detect instinctively. She had been speaking for nearly 30 minutes when Jason Orley, director, producer, and relentless truth-teller, decided to interject. Not with a question, but with a statement. It was casual on the surface, but beneath that casualness lay a calculated strike. He remarked, almost conversationally, about the overuse of buzzwords in her pitch and the performative gestures that accompanied them. He referenced her intentional pauses as though they were rehearsed for effect, pointing out that authenticity, in storytelling, is rarely scheduled. The executives didn't laugh aloud, but the tension in the room thickened. Meghan's team, still standing near the doorway, shifted nervously. She, on the other hand, smiled politely, convinced that charm could turn critique into approval. But then Jason took it further. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make it personal. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, narrowed his eyes, and made a pointed comment that cut to the heart of the matter. Your projects are less about the story and more about controlling perception. Audiences can tell when they're being sold an image rather than a narrative. The words hung in the air. Silence followed. Every executive's pen stopped moving. Every eye darted subtly, trying to process the unvarnished truth. Meghan blinked, searching for a counter, an acknowledgement, a single lifeline of affirmation. None came. In fact, the executives had begun exchanging glances that spoke volumes. The polite nods and facial expressions of her opening pitch had evaporated. They were now silently recording every word, every gesture, every lapse. From that moment, Meghan's meticulously crafted illusion began to crack. She tried to recover by reiterating her vision, emphasizing cultural relevance, global impact, and social consciousness. But Jason wasn't finished. He continued, incisive and relentless. exposing inconsistencies between her public statements and her actual body of work. He didn't insult. He didn't attack. But he dissected her credibility piece by piece, pointing out where her previous projects had failed to deliver on promises or had underperformed. It was surgical, precise, and devastating because it came without drama. It came as objective observation. And in Hollywood, objectivity from someone like Jason Orley carries weight far beyond opinion. Executives started typing subtle notes, sending quiet messages across the table. Meghan, sensing only that the room had become more serious, continued speaking, unaware that she was walking into the trap Jason had laid. Then came the moment that insiders later described as the beginning of the full humiliation. A senior executive quietly whispered, almost inaudibly, "Her energy is impressive, but is it sustainable?" Another nodded subtly, eyes flicking toward Meghan, but lips pressed tightly. Meghan misinterpreted these signals as curiosity or engagement. She smiled, unaware of the growing assessment. This was no longer a pitch. It was a performance under microscopic scrutiny. Jason, ever the tactician, paused, letting the tension build. He knew that humiliation, to be effective, doesn't need shouting. It doesn't need theatrics. It needs observation, precision, and timing. Every word, every glance, every hesitation from Meghan contributed to the narrative he was quietly building in the room. She was not a stable, reliable partner for creative projects. She was a risk. And then he made a comment that would become legendary in Hollywood circles. It was small, almost dismissive in tone, but it encapsulated everything insiders had whispered about Meghan for years. He remarked on her reliance on persona over substance, calling attention to the chasm between image and capability. The executives stifled nods, pens paused in agreement, and Meghan's face betrayed the first crack of doubt. She had been trying to project authority, confidence, and control, and in that single moment, the foundation she thought she was standing on began to crumble. But the humiliation didn't end there. Jason continued to speak, carefully, deliberately, highlighting examples of where previous projects associated with her had either failed to reach audiences or had been criticized for lacking authenticity. He didn't need to exaggerate. The evidence spoke for itself, and by now, Meghan's carefully rehearsed narrative was unraveling in real time. Her team, sensing the shift, began to panic quietly. Whispers floated from the doorway, redirect, reframe, smile. She's losing control. But the room, already attuned to Jason's assessment, couldn't be swayed by nervous whispers. The perception had already shifted, and in Hollywood, perception often matters more than reality. By the time Meghan attempted to recover, it was too late. Jason's calm, precise, and cutting commentary had already seeded doubt in the minds of everyone in that room. The executives, who had initially been polite, now began to exchange messages, comparing notes and quietly strategizing about the risks associated with future collaboration. Jason had not just criticized the pitch, he had evaluated her as a professional, as a partner, and as a person with influence over projects. And in his assessment, she fell short. The subtlety of the humiliation is what made it so effective. There was no shouting, no finger-pointing, no theatrical drama. Just cold, calculated observation and precise commentary. The executives didn't need to say much. Jason had already communicated the verdict. And Meghan, blissfully unaware, continued speaking, trying to assert control where none remained. When she finally concluded, silence dominated the room. Not polite silence. Not thoughtful contemplation, but a thick, oppressive pause, the kind that signifies judgment has been passed and is being quietly internalized. Meghan smiled, thinking she had impressed, thinking she had convinced, thinking she had dominated. She hadn't. She had been dissected, analyzed, and found wanting. After she left, the executives began the quiet work of documenting the assessment. Internal notes described her as a risk factor. Potential collaborators were warned. Group chats buzzed quietly with phrases that would never reach the press. High volatility, brand liability, not recommended. And in those subtle communications, the seed of blacklisting was sown. It wasn't just the pitch that had failed. It was her image, her perceived authority, her credibility. And Jason Orley had delivered it with surgical precision. The humiliation was complete because it was invisible in its methodical execution. There were no screams, no confrontations, no public spectacle, just an irreversible shift in perception. Meghan had walked into Amazon MGM Studios expecting triumph. She left under the shadow of a verdict she would never fully grasp in that moment. And for Hollywood insiders who witnessed the meeting or heard about it afterward, the consensus was clear. Her star, once bright in perception, had dimmed dramatically. And yet, what happened next, the leaks, the private messages, the whispers, would escalate the situation beyond private assessment. The room's quiet judgment would transform into public knowledge, creating a ripple effect that would reach every corner of the industry, effectively ending any chance she had at being taken seriously by major studios. Her PR team panicked the moment they realized what had just unfolded. Meghan Markle had walked into Amazon MGM Studios expecting to impress, to charm, to reclaim her place in Hollywood. Instead, she had unknowingly walked into a crucible of scrutiny that left executives whispering, assessing, and quietly documenting every word, gesture, and pause. And her team, whose job was to manage perception, spin narratives, and protect her image, felt the ground shift beneath their feet. The room itself hadn't changed, but the energy had. What had begun as polite curiosity had evolved into a quiet verdict. And while Meghan was still attempting to present her projects with confidence, the executives were evaluating her reliability as a partner, her consistency as a professional, and, ultimately, her viability as a brand. To the untrained eye, nothing had gone wrong. To her team, however, the writing was already on the wall. Inside the hallway just outside the conference room, whispers erupted among Meghan's handlers. "Redirect," one whispered urgently. "You need to reframe. Smile. Keep the momentum," another urged. Their voices were hushed but tense, betraying the nervous energy coursing through the team. They knew that even a small misstep could escalate into a full-blown reputational problem, and they could sense the moment had already arrived. One assistant, who had been quietly documenting the meeting for notes and cues, caught Meghan's hand mid-gesture and muttered, "Focus. Don't stumble now." Meghan nodded politely, misinterpreting the urgency as encouragement. But the team knew it wasn't encouragement. It was damage control. Inside the room, executives continued their silent assessments. Orley had already begun dissecting every phrase, every hand motion, every calculated pause. To him, Meghan's performance revealed a pattern he had seen before: charisma without substance, confidence without foundation, persona without authenticity. And when he detected these cracks, he didn't just note them. He leveraged them. He observed how they affected Meghan's rhythm, her pacing, and the subtle shifts in energy across the room. The result was immediate. Executives began texting discreetly, updating risk assessments, and sharing observations with colleagues outside the room. Comments like "potentially high volatility" and "brand risk escalating" floated silently through private channels. And while Meghan continued to speak, blissfully unaware, the narrative had already shifted against her. Her PR team, sensing the escalating tension, became increasingly frantic. One senior advisor leaned close and whispered, "We need to intervene before it's too late." Another muttered, "This is spiraling. She's overextending herself." They weren't exaggerating. Every gesture, every sentence Meghan delivered only highlighted the very vulnerabilities Jason had been observing. But the most critical moment occurred when Meghan attempted to pivot. She tried to emphasize her experience, her understanding of audience psychology, and her ability to deliver socially conscious content with mass appeal. She hoped to redirect attention from the subtle critiques and reclaim authority over the narrative. But the effect was opposite. By insisting on her own competence in a room already assessing risk, she inadvertently reinforced the executive's doubts. One executive later admitted privately that they had never witnessed such a disconnect between confidence and capability in someone so publicly acclaimed. Meghan's aura of control, her polished delivery, and her rehearsed charm, rather than convincing, had exposed her reliance on image over substance. The very tools she used to command attention, careful gestures, rehearsed phrases, orchestrated pauses, became markers of risk in the eyes of those responsible for greenlighting billion-dollar projects. Meanwhile, Meghan's team tried to salvage the situation. Notes were whispered into her ear. Subtle gestures were made to nudge her toward brevity. Hand signals reminded her to smile, to soften her tone, to connect emotionally. But the subtlety of Jason's observations had already disrupted the flow. Meghan's attempts to recover were, ironically, evidence of the instability her team feared. At one point, an assistant recalled seeing Meghan pause mid-sentence, a fleeting moment where her expression betrayed doubt. Her perfectly rehearsed facade cracked just enough for the room to detect uncertainty. Jason noted it immediately. It was the kind of micro-expression that most people miss, but not him. It wasn't malicious, it was precise observation. And in Hollywood, precision like that can define a career's trajectory. By the end of the pitch, Meghan's team was quietly strategizing exit plans. They considered ways to control damage, follow-up emails, personal apologies, clarifications to executives, and preemptive press releases. Their goal was simple: prevent the meeting from becoming a catalyst for public perception collapse. Yet even as they whispered, the executives were already planning the next steps. Internal communications were being sent to other departments, potential collaborators were being alerted, and private assessments of Meghan's fit were being updated in real time. The irony was stark. Meghan had believed she was the orchestrator of the room, yet her own team was now performing damage control to mitigate a situation she had unknowingly exacerbated. The dynamic had flipped. She was no longer in command. She was being observed, evaluated, and, in a quiet but decisive way, judged. Insiders later confirmed that the moment Meghan exited the room, a silent consensus formed. She was high risk. Not because she lacked talent, not because she lacked ideas, but because she had demonstrated volatility, over-reliance on image, and the inability to absorb criticism without destabilizing the environment. Jason's intervention, subtle and precise, had exposed these traits to the executives in a manner that left no doubt about potential consequences. And yet, Meghan remained oblivious. She left smiling, thinking she had captivated the room, reinforced her credibility, and solidified her position. Her team followed, relieved only that the meeting had concluded, unaware that the seeds of blacklisting had already been planted. What they didn't know was that the quiet assessment inside the room would soon manifest in a series of leaks, private messages, and group chats that would ripple through Hollywood like wildfire. Within hours, the aftermath began to surface. Executives began exchanging information discreetly with colleagues outside the immediate team. Comments in private channels, initially cautious, grew bolder. Discussions of risk, reputation, and long-term consequences for collaboration circulated rapidly. Names were mentioned, details were shared, and, eventually, the quiet label that would define Meghan's Hollywood prospects began to take shape. Unreliable. High risk. Blacklisted. The very team tasked with managing her image could do little to counteract the momentum. Every whispered suggestion, every tactical note, every attempt at immediate damage control could not undo what had occurred in that room. Jason's observations had not only assessed her performance, they had codified it into a narrative that would follow her, quietly and relentlessly, through the industry. Meghan's PR team later described the aftermath as chaotic, even frightening. Their phone lines lit up with urgent texts, calls from worried associates, and requests for clarifications from journalists who had received anonymous tips. The carefully constructed bubble around Meghan's public persona had begun to fracture. What had been a private assessment in a closed room now threatened to become a public story, and nothing her team could do would stop the momentum once it began. By the end of the day, insiders estimated that dozens of industry professionals had been informed, subtly warned, or briefed on the risk profile of working with Meghan. Projects that might have once seemed possible were quietly shelved. Meetings that could have led to collaborations were postponed indefinitely. And in that quiet but decisive way, her career trajectory had been altered. For Meghan, of course, none of this was visible. She left Amazon MGM Studios believing she had delivered a flawless pitch, secure in her star power, unaware that the executives had already begun strategizing for her exclusion. Her team, desperate to mitigate any fallout, could only scramble to contain the narrative, knowing that the room's assessment had already taken root in Hollywood's collective memory. And the most devastating part? It wasn't Jason's words alone that created the ripple effect. It was the combination of his precise, unvarnished critique, the executive's careful observation, and the team's frantic attempts to maintain control. Together, they formed a perfect storm that would, in the coming days, transform quiet professional assessments into widespread industry perception, and ultimately, blacklisting. As the day ended, Meghan's team regrouped, trying to understand what went wrong. They discussed tactical responses, follow-up meetings, clarification emails, strategic messaging. But insiders later revealed that even at that stage, executives had already drafted internal reports, documented concerns, and communicated warnings to other decision-makers. The momentum was irreversible. The damage had been done. And so, while Meghan's PR team scrambled to salvage perception, Hollywood insiders quietly celebrated a rare example of precision evaluation, where one meeting, one director, and one quietly executed assessment could shift the narrative around a high-profile figure in less than an hour. But what came next? The leaks, the whispers in group chats, the private messages circulating behind the scenes, would escalate everything to a level that Meghan and her team could never have anticipated. The private panic was about to become public humiliation, and the fallout would reach far beyond the walls of Amazon MGM studios. It only takes one moment, one offhand comment, one inadvertent slip, to turn private scrutiny into a public nightmare. For Meghan Markle, that moment arrived in a form she never anticipated. What was meant to be a controlled meeting, polite, professional, even productive, turned catastrophic because someone in the room, quietly and secretly, had captured it all. And in Hollywood, recordings are worth more than gold. Their power, leverage, and, occasionally, a weapon. By now, the Amazon MGM session had concluded. Meghan had left believing she had delivered a polished, persuasive pitch. She walked down the corridor with a practiced smile, nodding to her team and whispering polite gratitude to the executives she assumed had been charmed. Her PR team, still panicked from the subtle shifts they had observed during the pitch, began orchestrating post-meeting damage control. Emails to reinforce her credibility, calls to smooth over awkward moments, subtle text clarifications, but they had no idea that the room had already been breached in the quietest, most dangerous way possible, a recording. The recording was discreet. No obvious cameras, no booming microphones. Just a phone, hidden on the table, capturing every word, every nuance, every phrase. And in Hollywood, the moment something is recorded, it is immortal. Private meetings no longer remain private. Words said in confidence, critiques made in good faith, observations meant for internal ears only, they all become evidence when the wrong person has a device in their hand. Inside the room, the leak began subtly. One executive, noticing the recording device, initially dismissed it as inconsequential. But the content it captured was explosive in its implications. Jason Orley's incisive observations, delivered in his trademark calm and precise tone, were no longer confined to mental notes or internal assessment. They were now potential headlines, industry gossip, and proof of a quietly administered professional judgment. The recording revealed everything that Meghan's team had tried so desperately to keep controlled. The moments when Jason dissected her pitch, the subtle critiques that exposed her over-reliance on image over substance, and the observations about her patterns of behavior that suggested volatility and risk. Each sentence, each carefully worded phrase, became ammunition for those who had already been skeptical of her Hollywood viability. As insiders later described, the reactions to the recording were immediate and intense. Executives who had been on the periphery began sharing the content with colleagues they trusted. Private messages circulated. "You need to hear this. Watch how she responds. This confirms what we suspected." Within hours, the quietly assessed risk had transformed into a tangible, undeniable narrative. Meghan Markle, the woman who walked into the room expecting validation, had inadvertently provided the industry with irrefutable evidence of her own liabilities. Her PR team, meanwhile, was oblivious. They were busy crafting talking points, coaching Meghan on how to present herself in follow-up meetings, and attempting to mitigate any perceived awkwardness from the pitch. They had no idea that the content of the meeting was now circulating beyond Amazon MGM in private group chats, secure Slack channels, and encrypted messaging apps. Within Hollywood's tightly knit ecosystem, nothing remains contained for long, and the recording ensured that Meghan's private pitch would soon reach ears she never intended. By the end of the day, multiple insiders confirmed that the recording had already sparked heated discussions. Executive assistants forwarded snippets to producers. Agents quietly shared them with colleagues. Even studios not involved in the original meeting had begun to note her potential as a high-risk partner. Each passing hour amplified the perception of volatility. What had begun as subtle internal doubt was now solidifying into an almost universally acknowledged verdict. Meghan Markle was a liability. The implications were profound. Hollywood is a network, and networks thrive on trust and reliability. One misstep, one revelation of unpredictability, can cascade quickly, damaging not only current projects but future opportunities. The recording made her unpredictability tangible. It wasn't speculation anymore. It wasn't rumor. It was documented, real, and undeniable. Her team tried to act, of course. They initiated controlled responses, subtly questioning the validity of the recording, attempting to frame it as incomplete, out of context, or misinterpreted. But Hollywood insiders are sophisticated. They know the difference between nuance and spin. And in this case, the evidence was too clear, too compelling, too precise. Jason Orley had delivered a critique that couldn't be easily twisted into praise. Meanwhile, Meghan herself remained unaware.